The success of the BYU basketball program this season has brought some attention to Mark Pope and his future job prospects. What does that mean for BYU basketball? We're talking about it on today's show.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, your resident BYU insider. Thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Thank you to all of you who are everydayers with us right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And of course, this is your original daily podcast focused on all things BYU sports. And we are brought to you today by our friends over at FanDuel. Make every moment more with FanDuel. New customers join today and you'll get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 wins. Simple as that, my friends. Visit FanDuel.com/locked on to get started. All right, let's dive right in on today's show and talk some BYU hoops right out of the chute. Now, the success that BYU's had year one in the Big 12 has been, in many respects, surprising. I don't think any of us could have foreseen how solid the BYU basketball program has been this year, especially considering the fact that they were finishing among the worst finishes they've ever had in their final season of the West Coast Conference last year. There was a preseason poll taken, and BYU was picked 13th out of 14 teams in the Big 12. Obviously, the only team picked lower than them was UCF. And there was a lot of thought that, okay, what is the BYU basketball team really in for? Because the Big 12 is far and away the best basketball conference in the country. Well, alas, as it stands, BYU enters their final 5 games of the regular season very much in the mix in the middle of the Big 12 pack. And more importantly, looking like they're trending towards being, a 5, maybe a 6 seed in the NCAA tournament. With that attention, there is going to be increased conversations, conjecture, rumors, reports, whatever you want to term it, about what a guy like Mark Pope may be thinking about doing next. There are some people out there that believe that he may have been in over his head, leading BYU into the Big 12 conference. But the simple fact of the matter is that Mark Pope has pulled off an incredible turnaround job so far this season, and it looks like it's going to continue on into the postseason, into the March Madness, into the NCAA tournament, and who knows where it goes. Well, Jeff Borzello from ESPN wrote a really big piece on the guide to the college basketball future in terms of the coaching cycle coming up. And in the piece he did, and he talked about a lot of different coaches here, he broke down what the chances are. Some coaches may retire, some coaches may move on, some coaches may be fired, and then guys that may be looking at other opportunities. And amongst that group includes Mark Pope. So let me quote what is said here about Pope. Quote, "There's been buzz Pope could look at other opportunities this offseason after leading the Cougars into the Big 12 and the NCAA tournament for the first time since 2021. He could theoretically be a candidate at Washington or Oregon if either opens, but could also look to come back east," unquote. This is not surprising to anybody who's paid attention to Mark Pope and his run at BYU. There have been rumors when he's had his best teams. Think about in 2020, his debut. Think about in 2021 when he did, as they mentioned, get BYU into the NCAA basketball tournament. There have been rumors out there that he may have eyes elsewhere and have his eyes on a quote-unquote bigger job. Now, those rumors previously for the quote-unquote bigger job were because BYU was in a mid-major conference. They were a mid-major basketball program playing in the West Coast Conference. Alas, this year, BYU is a Big 12 member school, and in some sort of fashion, you would think, okay, now he's actually at a quote-unquote destination job where BYU can, in theory, pay him top-level money and keep him content in Provo. Do I believe that Mark Pope is looking for the first boat out of Provo, Utah? No, I don't believe that, frankly. But I do think that he is willing to listen to all comers when it comes to potential opportunities to look at other jobs. Washington is where he started his college career. He's a kid who grew up in the Pacific Northwest, up in the Seattle area. So going home to Washington wouldn't be a stretch by any means. Oregon, obviously, with all the money that has been pumped into Phil Knight University, as I like to call it, would be a very attractive job if Dana Altman decides to hang it up. Mike Hopkins is the coach at Washington currently, and he's very much on the hot seat. Now, Now, the interesting tidbit there could also look to come back east as the final stanza of that blurb about Pope. You know what that points to me? Is of a program like Kentucky. If John Calipari either gets the axe, decides to beat the posse out of town in Lexington and leaves the University of Kentucky, where did Mark Pope start? Oh, wait, University of Kentucky won a national title there. Now, let's also be honest about this. The Kentucky Wildcats will have their pick of the litter in terms of any guy that wants to potentially coach college basketball. That is maybe the most resource-rich job in terms of college basketball in the entire country. It is a program that, unlike many, you are the big cheese on campus over the football program. And I know that Kentucky's had a good run in football with Mark Stoops leading the way, but it is still Kentucky basketball that dominates that campus. There are very few universities in the Power 5 or the Power 6 ranks where you can truly say that, but Kentucky is that. But if Kentucky were to come open, I know that Mark Pope would be intrigued, at least hearing out what Kentucky had to say, or at least interviewing for that job. Is that a bad thing? Also, that BYU could potentially lose Mark Pope? I guess on paper it is, because it would be a thing. It would be kind of like, you just let us into the Big 12, you led us to a great season, and then, hey, you up and leave. That would be a little bit of a gut punch, I feel like, to Cougar fans. But let me also reiterate that if you've been paying any attention to the time that Mark Pope's been in Provo, A, he's been very happy to have been a head coach at BYU. B, he's a guy who has done his absolute darndest to kind of transform BYU basketball into a more modern version of itself. And C, he's not a guy who is married to staying at BYU. He is not a quote unquote BYU guy. There is a very interesting dichotomy and I don't know how to say this. There's an interesting dynamic at play. You look at BYU football, for example. Kalani Sitake has his dream job. This is a kid who grew up rooting for BYU, grew up dreaming of playing for Lavelle Edwards, lived that dream. And then when he got the opportunity to come back to BYU, he has taken that job, and he is very, very happy by all accounts being the head coach of BYU. And I don't see Kalani looking to jump ship. Is there a number out there that could be lobbed at him by a college football program that could tell him, you know what, it's been good, BYU, I'm leaving? Sure, I think everybody has their price. But there's an interesting thing that Mark Pope, as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he never had BYU, so far as I am aware, in the mix when it came to his recruiting both times, when he was coming out of high school and ended up at Washington, and then when he transferred from Washington, ultimately ended up at Kentucky. BYU wasn't in the mix there. I'm sure BYU made overtures, but all reports and everything that I've heard is that Mark Pope, it wasn't his thing for BYU. And that's not an indictment on anybody's part, whether that's BYU or his. It just wasn't in the cards for Mark Pope. He has been a great advocate for BYU basketball. I'm not saying that he hasn't been, but this is a guy who doesn't have the ties to BYU like other coaches on campus do. Jennifer Rockwood is synonymous with BYU soccer. You look at what Gordon Eakin's done for BYU softball. You look at some of the other coaches of yesteryear. Elaine Michaelis, for example. Remember, she was like the outside of the athletic director. Elaine Michaelis maybe was the most powerful individual, and maybe in some circumstances, because she was an AD for a time, she was the most powerful individual in the BYU athletic department, and she is synonymous with BYU sports. Mark Pope, simply put, is not that. So I am not surprised that with the success that BYU is having in hoops, that he is getting interest, or at least starting to see rumors pop up about his potential interest in looking elsewhere. I don't think it's a bad thing for him to look at that. And here's the other fact of the matter is, if he were to decide to move on, that's just like jumping the shark 4 different times to make that leap there. But you look at it, and the pool for coaches in terms of guys who are card-carrying members of the LDS faith, as it were, there's a decent pool out there of people that BYU could approach at that point. So it makes a lot of sense as to why he is getting these rumors starting to pop up about him. And at the same time, it's very natural, I feel like, at the same time, because Mark Pope, let me reiterate, he's not a quote-unquote dyed-in-the-wool BYU guy. So we'll see. It's a very interesting piece, and you can check it out. It is, you have to have a BYU, not the BYU, you have to have an ESPN Insider account. If you subscribe to ESPN Plus, you do have access to this. You can go and read it. But interesting to hear him being mentioned. But they've also got names like Randy Bennett on here. I know that you had Danny Sprinkle up at Utah State with what he's done for the Aggies, Nico Medved at Colorado State. Like this is an extremely in-depth piece looking at essentially every coach that could possibly move. But I did find it curious that Mark Pope was on that list, but I'm not surprised by anything that is said there because, like I said, as a Pacific Northwest guy, Oregon and Washington are natural, and going back east, well, that screams to me if Kentucky comes open, Mark very much would be, I think, interested in tossing his hat into that ring. All right. We will take a little more in-depth look at BYU basketball and what they are up against when they travel to Kansas State tomorrow. Another early tip for BYU. They struggled the last time they had this, remember, at Oklahoma State. How will they battle that, and can they overcome some of the issues they've had on the road and pick up a big road win over the Kansas State Wildcats? We'll break all that down and continue on right here on Locked On Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our new friends over at Ibotta. Now, Ibotta is here to help you guys save money. That's the incredible part about this. Grocery bills are expensive these days, but now they don't have to be. Start getting cash back on your grocery shopping with the free Ibotta app and get cash back every time you shop. I can attest to this. My wife and I have used Ibotta for at least, married almost 9 years now. We've probably used it for 8 of those years. It's a really, really awesome thing. Spring break is right around the corner. This means you're going shopping. You don't have to shop. You don't have to keep all that money in your pocket and worry about the big trip, get nothing in return. Make sure you're getting that cash back every time you shop, and do it with our friends at Ibotta. The average Ibotta user earns $256 a year. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip. So you have to buy that flight you've been eyeing, that game you've been dying to go to, or the fancy dinner you've been craving. They've got all options under the sun with our friends at Ibotta. So right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 just for trying using the promo code LOCKEDONCollege when you register. Go to the App Store or Google Play Store, download the free Ibotta app today to start earning cash back, and use that promo code LOCKEDONCollege, a free $5 for giving a shot using that promo code LOCKEDONCollege. It's IBOTTA in the Google Play or App Store, and use that promo code LOCKEDONCollege. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Appreciate all of you for being with us. Make sure you guys check out the first ever National Sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube from our friends over the Locked On Podcast Network. It's also now available on the Amazon Fire TV app with the free Fire TV channels app. Check it out today. It's Locked On Sports Today. Is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today on YouTube, or check it out available now on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app, and start watching it today. All right. Just a little bit of an aside. I just realized I'm like kind of looking at myself as I'm recording this. I've got a blue polo on, and this is very much a navy blue hat as well. But in my look for my camera, if you're watching this on YouTube, two very different shades. Like this hat looks black, but nonetheless, hey, aesthetics. But let's talk some BYU basketball as we move along here. Now, the Cougars are on the road tomorrow at Kansas State. This is a big game for BYU, considering they got the big win earlier this week. Can you make it 2-0? And that'll be the interesting part about how BYU handles this. We have talked on this podcast about the need at minimum for BYU to go 1-1 each week, and they have essentially done that. They're sitting at 7-6 in conference play. That's right down the line. If we went 1-1 every week in conference, they'd be 9-9 at the end of the season. We talked about the fact that they do that, they'd likely be a 6 or 7 seed in the NCAA tournament and be in a very advantageous spot going into March Madness. Well, you have an opportunity as you go into this game against Kansas State to pick up a win that would push you 2 games above 500 to 8-6. And I think this is a prime game for BYU to get that done. Now, I also did think that was a prime opportunity last week when BYU went to Oklahoma State and got absolutely blitzed off the floor by the Oklahoma State Cowboys. Jerome Tang's squad in the last 8 games has exactly 1 win. Yes, they are 1-7. The only win that they have came when they upset Kansas in the rivalry matchup. That was just before they came to Provo to take on BYU. Obviously, BYU sent them packing with a 72-66 victory. Since then, they have lost a home game to TCU and also lost on the road at Texas. And they are very much looking at the prospect of missing out on the NCAA tournament. And it doesn't look very promising, even if they were to win out in terms of getting an at-large bid. It feels like this Kansas State squad could have to win the Big 12 tournament if they want to punch their ticket to the postseason. So you can expect tomorrow for Kansas State to be very, very hungry to pick up a win. Losing 7 of 8 games is not going to leave a good taste in anybody's mouth. And you can be assured that BYU is a team that they're looking at saying, you know what, we had a chance to get that win in Provo. Let's make sure we get some payback in this game. In terms of stats, for guys to keep an eye on, you guys probably are already familiar with these guys, but Cam Carter and Tyler Perry are their 2 leaders in the backcourt, both of them averaging 15 points per game. But Arthur Kaluma is a guy that I really, really like as a prospect. He's just one of those guys that I like to watch because he's got a very smooth style. Remember, Kaluma was helped off the court. Look how he rolled his ankle badly against BYU in that win in Provo, then returned like moments later and just started going off. He was very, very good in that game. He averages 14.5 points per game, also 7.1 rebounds. So they have got firepower. We all saw that in that game against BYU in Provo, but now they have got the home court advantage as BYU goes in here. And the interesting part will be, as Mark Pope pointed out in his Thursday media availability, is we don't know what Spencer Johnson's status is going to be. His wife, Isabella, went into labor. According to what I was reading right before I pushed record on this, they had the baby. To what sounded like coming out of his coach's show with Greg Wrubell. So, well, first off, congratulations to Spencer Johnson. The birth of your first child is a life-changing event. I've got 3 kids now, and no offense to my 2 sons who are my number 2 and number 3 kids, but my daughter, when she was born, it hits you like a sack of bricks when you have your first kid. And who knows what Spencer Johnson's status is. So if he's available, if he's not available, it is what it is. But BYU has to go out there intent on getting a road win here. But not having him in the lineup takes one of your better perimeter defenders off the court, and BYU will have to counter that, obviously, with other guys being able to step up into that role. I am interested to see how they will juggle the lineup in terms of starters. Maybe they move Jackson Robinson, as many of you have been hoping for, back into the starting lineup to fill in for Spencer Johnson, or maybe they do something different. I am interested to see how the lineup goes for BYU if he is unavailable for this game, and I would completely understand it with the birth of his first child. It's just, any of you who have had kids, and I know that some of you have, some of you haven't, who watch this podcast, it changes everything in your world. So I can understand if Spencer wants to take a breath and be able to enjoy the time with his wife and their newborn, but regardless, this is a big opportunity for BYU to go on the road. I am looking forward to seeing how BYU's bigs, in terms of Fousseyni Traore and in particular Ali Khalifa, perform in this game. Ali Khalifa had maybe his best game in 2, 3, maybe even a month with that 14-7-7 game earlier this week. Can he back that up on the road? If he can do that, also, let me just, as an aside, if he can continue to kind of pump out those type of stats where he's closing in on triple-double territory, he's contributing and scoring, facilitating, and rebounding. If Ali Khalifa is going to be like that down the stretch here for BYU, this is an extremely dangerous BYU lineup with him in the lineup at minimum, but producing those type of stats. And oh, by the way, those 7 assists were up against 0 turnovers. If his assist to turnover ratio continues to remain absurd as it has been all season long, BYU could be trending in the right direction at the right time. So I look forward to this game. It's a big opportunity, as I said, to push BYU to 8-6 in the conference. If you look at how seeding is going to go for BYU, I thought that Robbie McCombs did a really, really good job breaking down where he thinks BYU ultimately ends up on Selection Sunday, and I tend to agree with him. I think a 6th seed is the most likely spot for BYU, but if you want to harbor illusions of playing in Salt Lake City in front of a home crowd in the Delta Center, well, BYU has that opportunity in front of them. It's going to take them winning a lot down the stretch here, and it starts with this game against Kansas State. You cannot take the Wildcats lightly because, as I mentioned, they've lost 7 of 8 games. They are going to be hell-bent on coming into this one and saying, no, we are not losing our 8th of the last 9, and very much putting a stake in any hopes we have of postseason in terms of the NCAA tournament. So expect a dogfight, a cat. Oh no, actually, I back that up. Rewind. A cat fight. There we go. Wildcats and Cougars. Got it. Okay, use the pun. But looking forward to seeing how this plays out. And the other thing about this is last week BYU didn't necessarily respond all that well to playing the early tip. It was a noon Mountain Time tip. Same thing as we're going to see in this game tomorrow. It'll be 1:00 Central, but it is a noon Mountain Time tip. A little earlier on the body clock for BYU. They have to prove they can adjust to that as well. I am interested to see how they handled that. And then Mark Pope also pointed out that BYU is going to travel home after this game rather than remain out there in Kansas ahead of their game against Kansas on Tuesday night. I think it's actually a pretty smart move because flying the West Virginia to Oklahoma thing, okay, flying across the country to West Virginia, flying home and then flying to Oklahoma, that seemed a little ridiculous. This is a much shorter hop going from Manhattan, Kansas, which is on the west side of Kansas, essentially, coming home to Provo and then flying back out on Monday to get into Lawrence to take on the Kansas Jayhawks. I think it's a pretty smart move on Mark Pope's part. But the other thing about this is a lot of the stuff with the Big 12 for BYU, it's all a feeling out process. They're still trying to kind of learn the dynamics. Okay, where do we travel? And Baylor did that exact thing. They went, were they West Virginia before they came to BYU? And they traveled immediately to Provo. They didn't go home to Texas. And Scott Drew was very effusive in his praise for BYU for accommodating them. But it is a unique dynamic now with these bigger conferences. All the travel that's being required across the country. BYU's made a trip to UCF. They've been to West Virginia. It is going to be kind of interesting to see the dynamics of, okay, do you travel, come home and travel again, or do you stay on the road and play those two games? It's all a learning process. And I think the entire conference in many respects is still learning that as well. But I am interested to see how BYU handles this tomorrow. But I've got a pretty decent feeling about BYU in this one because I look at the way BYU played earlier this week and you're like, okay, can they kind of exercise some demons that that hindered them in their loss in Waco to Baylor? Well, they did that and more, and they just controlled that game, and they took control of it about 10 minutes into the game and never relinquished control. Can they do that same thing on the road? It's much tougher, obviously, to control that when you've got a hostile crowd behind the home team and you're the hated guys on the court, but I am interested to see how things go in this one, and I've got a decent feeling about BYU, and it'd be a big win, honestly. And I know that a team that's lost 7 or 8 doesn't necessarily scream big win, but what I mean big win is it would be just a big win for BYU seeding-wise and essentially establishing themselves much more in the territory of being that quote-unquote lock for the NCAA tournament and in play to potentially play at home 40 miles north at the Delta Center in the first 2 rounds of the NCAA tournament. All right. We will wrap up today's edition of the show with a quick football position preview. I had a lot of basketball talk today, so we're going to fit in our specialist preview as we close out the week here on the podcast. Coming up next, we'll also look at where other BYU teams are in action this weekend as we roll on right here on Locked On Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Of course, FanDuel has been with us all season long, football and basketball. They want to get you guys buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Think about that. It's $150 if your bet wins. That's the incredible part about it. But all your favorite NBA players and teams, as well as college basketball, if you want to bet on BYU, you can do that as well. They've got quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props that are only available on FanDuel and their app. You also can do the simple stuff. You can go over, under, spreads, whatever you want to do when it comes to sports betting and in the basketball realm. You can do it with our friends at FanDuel, and that offer $150 if your $5 bet wins. The risk versus reward, it's astronomically one-sided. So take advantage of it today, my friends. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot today. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started today. Shoot your shot with our friends at FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Today's show is also brought to you by our friends at Utah Community Credit Union. They have an incredible new feature called Elevated Checking. They have elevated their checking accounts by enhancing them with more benefits, more savings, and more online protections, my friends. A lot more. Paired with the most advanced and comprehensive mobile banking tools, Elevated Checking is a must-have financial product packed with lifestyle, security, and financial benefits, and you guys can get it today. The lifestyle benefits alone include cell phone protection, roadside assistance, telehealth with 24/7 access to licensed health professionals with zero copay, and exclusive savings on travel, shopping, and dining. Think about that. It's like a win-win-win all the way around, my friends. And Elevated Checking is free when you do any one of the following. Use your debit or credit card 15 times or more a month, make a monthly direct deposit of $500 or more, or maintain an average daily balance of $1,500. Otherwise, UCCU and their Elevated Checking is just $6 a month. To take advantage of all of these options, so visit uccu.com to open an Elevated Checking account online today, or you can stop by any branch and open that account in person. It's all courtesy of UCCU. Love where you bank. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Appreciate all of your guys' support of this podcast. All right, a couple of notes before we go on today's show. Let's talk BYU specialists. Now, the specialists in football are obviously they're role players, and that's not a bad thing. They do have their role, and they are important. Remember, last spring camp, and that's what we're doing. We're previewing spring camp for the specialists. Remember, last spring camp, what were we talking about? Wow, it is like woe unto the masses when it comes to BYU's kicking game. Well, they found a kicker coming out of spring camp, and they invested in what they had at that position. And the nice part was that Will Ferrin delivered in spades, frankly, for BYU last season. It was very, very solid. He will obviously enter spring camp as the favorite to retain his job as BYU starting kicker. Now, there are two other kickers on BYU's roster, Matthias Dunn, who was very much in the mix last year, essentially finishing as the runner-up in that kicking competition, and then Jordan Capisi, a walk-on from Honolulu, Hawaii, who'll be looking to make a move up the depth chart at kicker. But the funny thing about this season is now the real competition is flipping over at the other kicking spot, and that's the punter spot. Now, Ryan Rico exits BYU and very much looks like he may be on his way to a fruitful NFL career, whether he's drafted or he's picked up as a free agent. It just looks like teams are really in love with that monster leg he has on him, and for good reason, because the dude can absolutely boom it. But now it leaves an interesting a debate here. What is BYU's plan going to be with regards to how they're going to handle the situation with their punt game? Do they want more of the traditional style of what Ryan Rico brought to the table? Will Kelly Poppinga favor that? If so, Landon Rico, the younger brother of Ryan Rico, would very much be in the mix to be the next guy and carry on a family legacy as BYU's punter. Now, the other question is, okay, do you want more of dynamic style at punter? And that is the interesting part about this, because Sam Vander, who we've had on this podcast, comes to BYU as a rugby style punter. He does have the ability to do more of the traditional kick, as he has mentioned on this podcast, but he does have that ability as a former Australian rules rugby football player to kick with both feet, be able to run, kick it on the run. If you're going to favor that style, well, that's the kind of dichotomy of what this battle will be at punter for BYU. I know that a punter battle is not going to draw headlines from any BYU fans, but it's really the only big intrigue I feel like for BYU special teams wise. You've got another Riggs brother set to reprise the role as BYU's deep snapper. You had Austin Riggs enter the transfer portal. He is headed to Rutgers for his final year of eligibility. Well, by the way, the brotherly connection we talked about with the Ricos, well, continues on with Dalton Riggs stepping in and looking like he's going to be BYU's deep snapper in 2024. So there's not a lot of question marks about BYU special teams outside of that punter spot. And really, it feels like for the punter spot it's more of a question for Kelly Poppinga as BYU special teams coordinator of which style he wants in terms of his punt game. Does he want more of the dynamic ability of what Sam Vander can offer to BYU, or does he want more of a traditional NFL straightforward type punt that Landon Rico can offer? Can Landon Rico, by the way, prove that he can be more of that dynamic rollout rugby style kick? If he can do that, sweet. It adds just that other element to BYU special teams. And that's, I know that like specialists don't really draw all that big of headlines, and that's why we're sticking it here late in a show on a Friday. But that's the biggest conversation piece about BYU specialist position is what the punter philosophy is going to be like going forward. I think in terms of returners, BYU's got some really dynamic talents. I think Keelan Marion is set to reprise his role as BYU's kick returner. I think you could keep an eye on Parker Kingston and his ability to be a punt/kick returner as well. There's some really, really nice speed with those two, and that element could lend itself to BYU being more dangerous in the return game. But that's really all I got for you guys on the specialists. There's just not a lot of headlines, and that's kind of the way that specialists like to operate. They're kind of like offensive linemen. They toil in anonymity, and when people know your name as a specialist, usually a bad thing. So we'll see how they do on that front. Now, a couple of notes real quick, looking ahead to the weekend for BYU sports. You have the Big 12 championships, indoor championships for men's and women's track and field. Those are taking place in Lubbock, Texas. So best of luck to the BYU athletes down there in West Texas at that one. You have women's tennis in action today. They are at Fresno State at 3:00 Mountain Time. BYU baseball also out there in the Northern California region. They're taking on UC Davis. They absolutely hammered the Aggies yesterday, 20-4. tour. So they're back at it 3:00 this afternoon. You can listen to that one on BYU Radio. Dave McCann will have the call of that one. And then BYU softball continues playing the Mary Nutter Classic. They crushed Bethune-Cookman yesterday, 18-5. They take on Long Beach State at 4:30 p.m. Mountain Time this afternoon down in Cathedral City, California. And then, as I mentioned, you got BYU basketball. Men's basketball takes on Kansas State at 12:00 tomorrow. BYU baseball finishes up their series against UC Davis at 12:00 as well tomorrow afternoon. And then you have women's basketball on the road in their own right at Iowa State. That's a 5:00 tip out there in Ames. That'll be on BYU Radio, also on Big 12 now on ESPN Plus if you want to tune into it that way. I forgot to mention earlier, the men's game is also streaming only. It's Big 12 now on ESPN Plus if you want to tune into that. And then the final note I got for you guys is that BYU men's volleyball, they've got a big weekend. They got number 4 UCLA in town for back-to-back matches at the Smith Fieldhouse. So best of luck to the men's volleyball program. You can catch both of those matches on BYU TV this weekend as well. So there you go. That's what I got for you guys on this Friday edition of the show. A big thank you, as always, for your support. A little bit of a tease ahead. I have a conversation scheduled to catch up with Max Chadwick from Pro Football Focus with a thought to really kind of focus on Kingsley Suamataia as BYU's top NFL draft prospect. The NFL Combine is about to get underway, so we'll catch up with him. And I do have plans to catch up with Connor Payton next week as well. We'll talk BYU offensive line, the EA college football game, the NIL feature in that, and obviously get you ready for spring camp with him as well. So that's what I got for you guys. So thank you for the support of the podcast. As always, thank you for making it your first listen of the day. Thank you truthfully for being everydayers, to all of you who are our everydayers here on the podcast. And of course, we'll catch you guys again soon right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.